fabulous. Hey, so we're going to talk tonight about Dewey defeats Truman, the 1948 election. But before we do that, let's talk about one of your other books that is also is a deep dive into what happened in World War II that enabled the U.S. to just massively outproduce the Axis powers in planes and tanks and everything else. So tell us a little bit about that book. It's a really great topic.
Well, thank you. You know, that book, I wrote it. It came out in 2014. It's called The Arsenal of Democracy. And the premise is that FDR comes up with this idea of, he thinks, hey, we're going to get in this war and we need to win it, and we're behind in everything. Hitler's been creating this, the first real air force, and he's been building his war machine for many years, and that this was going to be a new kind of war that was going to be a mechanized war, and would be essentially a contest of mass production. And so he leans on the Detroit automobile companies to win the war. So the book is about really how Detroit won World War II, with the focus on the Ford family. And the reason I focus on the Ford family is there's 3 generations of the Ford family that appear in the book, and they're having this internal Shakespearean power struggle that's fascinating, at the same time that they build the largest airplane factory in the world and start building the B-24 Liberator, which, because of the Ford, becomes the most mass-produced American military aircraft of all time, up to this day still.
Well, our hope is that we can have you back to talk about that. And tonight, let me welcome folks. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of The Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. We are excited to have with us tonight A.J. Baime. A.J. is the New York Times bestselling author of numerous nonfiction books, including Dewey Defeats Truman, The Accidental President, The Arsenal of Democracy, and Go Like Hell. 3 of those books have been optioned for film or television. He is a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, for whom he writes the weekly My Ride car column. He has also written for the New York Times and the Washington Post. He lives in Northern California, and he's joining us tonight to talk about his book, Dewey Defeats Truman. Thank you so much for joining us, AJ.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with the cover of your book, probably one of the most famous headlines in the Western world. What's the story behind that headline?
Well, let's go with the most infamous headline. So what happened is, I don't want to give away the ending, but in 1948, Harry Truman won the greatest upset in American electioneering history. And he's in Kansas City when he wins the election, and he has to take this train back to Washington, D.C. And he stops off in St. Louis, and somebody hands him this newspaper. He's on the back of his train. He holds it up, and the look on his face is just such ecstasy, because he had won against all odds. And here was the Chicago Tribune headline saying Dewey defeats Truman. But one of the interesting things about it is, it's become the most famous headline ever written, for sure. But, one of the things I found in my research is all over the world, people were reporting that Dewey had won. As far as Munich, Germany, Women's Wear Daily, all of these publications were talking about the new president, Thomas Dewey.
Well, now, just to close that out, though, as I recall, wasn't there an issue with the staffing of the newspaper there in Chicago, and people leaving early or something or other? It was like, we're just going to get that out.
I think that's what happened. And
okay.
And you'll see occasionally, it was only the first edition. So they fixed it.
Right.
And, they only printed 150,000 copies of this. So they fixed it and got the new issue out the door. But you'll see in the Chicago Tribune still, if you Google it, every now and then the Tribune will revisit this amazingly humiliating moment. Because that's what newspapers have to do. They have to stand up, to the truth. And they made quite a mistake. But what I love about the picture itself is the awe. Just like, I don't think we'll ever capture a picture of an American president who, just exuding that kind of raw joy. Not an easy job. And I think President Truman had a lot of hard times in the White House. That's why he called it the Great White Jail. Maybe let's
talk about the haberdasher from Kansas. Do I have that right? Wasn't that the
Independence,
reference?
Missouri.
I'm sorry, Independence, Missouri. So let's give us a little background, and then how did he become FDR's VP? Here we've got a president that before he passes away has been so lionized and is considering running for yet another term and so forth.
Well, I think what the overarching theme that makes the Truman story so amazing and just like fun to write and fun to read about is the fact that through every step of this man's life, he was just an incredible underdog. So he starts out, he was well into his 30s. He's an obscure farmer. Nobody's ever heard of him. And he ends up falling into politics because he needed a way to make money. And so he goes out and he tries to get this job as a Jackson County judge. Nobody's heard of him, but this happens, and it's very unlikely that he actually wins. And then he gets lassoed up into this whole political machine out of Kansas City, run by this guy named Tom Pendergast, who's a crooked political machine operator who finds it in his best interest for all sorts of reasons to take this obscure ex-farmer who has no experience in politics and campaign him for the United States Senate. And Pendergast is so powerful that now Harry Truman wins, and he gets to, he goes to Washington. And already now he's at an older age. Nobody will talk to him because they think he's Pendergast's errand boy, and he's crooked and all of this. And so 6 years goes by, 1940. Again, he has to campaign, and again everybody says there's no way this guy can win. And again he wins. It's just this series of incredibly unlikely events that ends up landing him on the 1944 ticket with FDR.
And how did that actually come about? We have all these stories about how the vice president gets chosen. Sometimes it's the staff or whatever. As it turns out, of course, Harry Truman steps into the presidency at a critical time for the world, but obviously that wasn't known at his selection. How does he get picked to be the vice president?
Well, the system worked differently back then. So the Democratic Party at the National Convention would actually vote on ballots and vote in the VP candidate. And Truman is very obscure still, but there are these machinations in the White House where FDR is realizing his current vice presidential candidate, Henry Wallace, is what we might call these days a wackadoo. People thought that he was way too far to the left. He was a strange man, and he had strange habits, and he made a lot of people in FDR's inner circle very uncomfortable. And so they created this sort of these machinations to get him off the ticket. So then they have to decide who's going to get on the ticket. And James F. Burns of South Carolina would have been by far the most qualified because of his resume, and he was very close with FDR, and people were already calling him the assistant president. But FDR realizes that, in 1944, and this is really important, he senses that for the first time ever, really, the power of the black vote was really going to matter. And that had really never happened before in terms of national politics. And he realizes that he and his team around him, it's more his team around him, they realize that James F. Burns is not going to work because he's from South Carolina and he was a racist. He was a white supremacist. And it was well known, and he would speak publicly about it. And so they thought, we can't have this guy in a ticket. We're going to lose a lot of voters if we do. And so they have to come up with somebody. And they go through this list. There's this smoke-filled room scene in the White House. And they come up with Harry Truman. And the reason why is because they thought, well, Harry Truman is this guy that, he's not going to upset anybody. Nobody really knows who he is. So we can stick him on the ticket. Nobody's going to get mad. And they'll just vote for FDR. And they'll think that FDR will be president for another 4 more years. And that'll be that.
Very interesting. What had Harry Truman done up to that point as a senator? Anything particularly notable?
Yes, 2 things. One is he voted for along Roosevelt's party lines almost entirely. So Roosevelt said, here's a loyal guy to the Democratic Party. That's fine. But more importantly, during World War II, Truman launched something called the Truman Committee. It had a much more complicated, longer name, but it's known as the Truman Committee. And his idea in 1941 was, hey, suddenly we're talking about going to war. And the federal government is suddenly spending incredible amounts of money, unprecedented, on tooling up factories because World War II was turning out to be this contest of mass production. We needed to mass produce everything from these 60,000-pound bombers to pairs of underwear, literally, and guns and bullets and all kinds of different machinery, field kitchen, amphibious vehicles. And so the federal government is just spending like crazy. And Truman realizes, because of his experiences in rural Jackson County, Missouri, that when the government spends a lot of money, it ends up often in the wrong pockets. And so he launches something called the Truman Committee, which is basically a watchdog. And, it was said at the time that he saved the government, something like $150 million by doing investigative work, going and figuring out where the money was going and where it should be going. And this was his first chance to really achieve any sort of national notoriety. And so that's what happened. That's what made him during World War II, and I think really helped to get him on the ticket. So
there he is, ends up, he's vice president, becomes president, and refers to the White House as, and I think you said it earlier, the white jail or his jail. How does he decide that I'm going to go out, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to run because I want 4 more years of this?
Well, he's very indecisive, all the way up to December 1947. And his reasoning is, if you think about the post-war years and everything that it took to change this country from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, it was impossible for any president to succeed during that time. There were labor crises. There were housing shortages. There was 100,000 homeless war veterans on the streets of Chicago alone. Inflation was terrifying people. Prices of everything, was going up, and people were really concerned that there was going to be another depression and that there was going to be another war. And nobody trusted Truman. After winning the war, his approval rating goes diving into the dumps. And but it's my thesis that nobody could have succeeded in his shoes. And he began to call the White House a great white jail because nobody was happy with anything he did. But it was really, every decision he had to make seemed to be a decision between which was the least worst thing that can happen. And so by the end of 1947, he wanted out of that job. He was very concerned, and I think this is extremely important, about his character. He was very concerned about what the job was doing to his family. He had a young daughter, and he was uncomfortable with the suffering that his family had to go through because of his own fame and infamy, because he was such a disliked president in 1947. But finally, he decides, you know what? There's too much at stake in this election. It's the first post-war presidential election, the first of the television age, the first of the nuclear age. And he realizes that this is a line in the sand that's going to separate the past from the future. And he's afraid what's going to happen, frankly, if the Republican Party won. And we'll get into that because that might be an interesting thing to talk about.
Let's do that. But let me ask you about one of his decisions, and you referenced it just a second ago, his decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs. Decades later, right, there are questions about this. At the time, was there any negative reaction? Was there any sense of, gosh, this is yet another reason why we don't think that Truman should be the next president?
Well, Lee, I can certainly tell you there was a lot of negative reaction in Japan. But in America, I think a lot of that negativity really grew through time.
Yeah.
It took time because at the time we wanted to win the war. We wanted to end the war. And it's very important for people to understand the context in which these decisions were made. Just as an example, the American people sort of knew that we were planning to send hundreds of thousands of troops to attack the Japanese mainland and would have resulted in thousands and thousands and thousands of American casualties. And the Secretary of War was producing, and the head of was producing documents saying, this is how many people we think are going to die. And Truman said, the other thing you have to realize, of course, at the time was the bomb was this tremendous, tremendous scientific victory. The fact that we had figured this out with American know-how. It took some time for people to start saying, that might have been before people started using the word war crime
Yeah.
to describe bombs.
Yeah. Well, and my asking that question, certainly no negative view on that decision. I think it was absolutely the right one. But in the context of, people's assessment of Truman, it was certainly obviously a major decision. So let's go then to the other side of the aisle, the Republicans. Who are they running?
Well, let's see a picture. I think we have a picture of Tom Dewey. We can show it to our listeners here. But so both political parties coming out of World War II are suffering an identity crisis, and the Republicans as well. Now, the Republicans are pretty sure that they're going to win the election no matter who they run. And there's a split in the party, a tug of war between the liberal faction of the party, who was Tom Dewey, and he was a Theodore Roosevelt Republican. He was a progressive. And the conservative faction of the Republican Party, which was really headed up by Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio. And so the Republican Party is pulling and shoving, trying to define who we are. Who are we coming into the post-war world? And they go through this whole process into the convention, and Dewey wins. And what's remarkable, because Dewey was really a progressive Republican, he actually agreed with Truman on a lot of what have been, of policy matters like Israel, like civil rights, and spending. Tom Dewey was not a fiscal conservative. He wanted to spend some money, just like Truman did. Maybe not quite as much or not nearly as much, but he was not averse to, spending federal dollars and taxing Americans. So it was really an interesting tug of war inside the Republican Party. And as I said, Dewey won.
So World War II certainly kind of birthed this much larger federal government, and obviously during the in response to the Depression and so forth, FDR launched a series of initiatives, various social programs, agencies, and so on. To what extent were those an issue in the campaign? To what extent was there consideration of, should any of those be scaled back? Should they be expanded?
Well, excellent. For starters, let's just look. This is Tom Dewey at the Republican National Convention. It was interesting. Early in his campaign, he was criticized, and the only thing they could say to criticize him was that there was too much perfection in his speeches. Because just everybody in America thought, well, this is our slick new president. So this is just a wonderful picture of him. I love this picture. And, I don't know if we'll get back to this, so I'll say it now. I think he would have made a very fine president. I really do. A very fine two-term president. Okay, so to address your question, remind me what it was. It was
just in terms of what was one of the issues in the campaign, this whole matter of kind of the future size of the federal government. We've now got a much larger federal government with programs launched from as a result of the response to the Great Depression, and then we've got the buildup from World War II and so forth. Was there a discussion about, okay, well, here's kind of the direction that we want for the country in terms of the role of the federal government? Was that an issue in the election?
Absolutely. So maybe I could ask if we put up the picture we have of Truman now, and to attack that question, Lee, what I can say is when Truman comes back from Potsdam, he comes back, we drop the bombs. That's Harry Truman with his only child. And I think that's best besides, but anyway, that's Margaret, and they're voting. That's voting day. They're dropping their ballots in. I believe it's November 2nd, 1948. Now, Truman, when he comes back from Potsdam, and this is all in my book, The Accidental President, this one, which is sort of a prequel. It's very much prequel. The two books go together. And when he gets back, we drop the bomb, we win the war. And that's where this book, Dewey Defeats Truman, starts. And he has to come out because, he had been vice president during the, FDR's term. And now it's 4 months of war and we win the war. And now Truman's like, oh, nobody ever expected this guy to be president. What am I going to do? What is my legacy going to be? What do I stand by my policy? And so he creates this speech called the 21-point program. And he gets on the radio, national radio, and he says, these are the 21 things that I essentially want to spend a tremendous amount of money. He wanted to keep the federal government large and spendy. And Tom Dewey never attacked him for it, but the conservative faction on Capitol Hill they were nuts. They went crazy. And that's when Robert Taft made this famous speech saying that Truman was a Santa Claus because he had a gift. Santa Claus is the term he used because he had a gift for anybody who wanted one. And so the conservative faction on Capitol Hill, very powerful. By the way, by 1948, they control the House and the Senate. And they campaign against Truman for being, wanting to keep federal government large. And so that's why when Truman runs for president in 1948, he almost never says the word Tom Dewey, ever. And he doesn't even campaign against Tom Dewey because he knows that Tom Dewey agrees policy-wise with a lot of what he's saying. He campaigns against the 80th Congress. He campaigns against the congressional faction that is, ruthlessly attacking him all the time. And I think the most major point that they were fighting each other was about the federal government spending money.
Interesting. Well, so I think our viewers are probably more familiar with Harry Truman than they are of Tom Dewey. Give us a little sense of him, the personality, him on the campaign trail, and perhaps contrast it with Harry Truman and his train trips and campaign stops.
Well, let me start by saying, with Dewey Defeats Truman, this book, I really wanted to do something. A lot of books have been written about the 1948 election. And what I really tried to do was to really tell the story of all four campaigns, because there were four. Obviously, Truman comes out to be the main character, but there were four fascinating campaigns. Each of them was so interesting, what they were trying to do and how they went about campaigning, what they did. And Tom Dewey, he was this figure who came up as a prosecutor. And he was a crime fighter. And it's hard to imagine in today's world how a prosecutor could have become as famous as Tom Dewey was in the late 1930s, because he was cracking down on the likes of all the Prohibition era gangsters and putting all of these huge, larger-than-life gangsters in prison. And he was so famous that 2 movies were made about him, with Humphrey Bogart playing the crime-fighting Tom Dewey character. 2 Humphrey Bogart movies. He was a well-known figure. And so when he gets to running in 1948, he's already an extremely popular governor of New York. In I believe, 1946, the year that the Republicans won back the Senate and the House, Dewey won his second term in office in Albany, in New York, by more votes than anyone ever had. He was a popular guy. And as I said, I think that he would have made an amazing president. And there's a couple of moments that are so poignant. Like, I really wanted to put the reader in his shoes to experience what it was like to lose in 1948. And it's election night. He's supposed to come down 9 o'clock and give his acceptance speech to his in the Hotel Roosevelt. And he doesn't come down. And meanwhile, the Republican National Committee is pumping out all these press releases all night long. It is now confirmed. Tom Dewey is the next president of the United States. It is now confirmed. Dewey wins the presidency. So the RNC, the Republican National Committee, is pumping out these press releases. And of course, we have all of them. It's no disputing it. And Tom Dewey shuts himself into his hotel suite alone with a yellow legal pad, listening to the radio and just taking notes. And it's slowly coming over him what's about to happen, that he's going to lose the greatest upset in American election year in history. And it was actually going to be 2 elections in a row, because he also lost to FDR in 1944. So, he initially, Tom Dewey was afraid to run in 1948 because he thought, if I lose, that's all I'm going to be remembered for. I've done all of these amazing things. And sadly, it's true. He lost, and nobody knows anything about Tom Dewey anymore except this. That's kind of sad. That's why we write history, so people know.
Do you want to talk about those other campaigns?
I do. I would love to. I think that we can learn as much about our country and about human beings by reading the stories of political misfits who were incredibly, really passionate about what they were campaigning for. So we have a picture of Strom Thurmond. Let's see that one. Can we see it? So Strom Thurmond. Okay. 1948, the reason why it's such a famous election is because it's this intersection of all of this stuff going on where the whole world is recreating itself. And a major issue here, and this is something I've written a lot about, is civil rights. So Truman goes on this unprecedented campaign for two reasons, for civil rights, for two reasons. One is he believes that the black vote is going to be more powerful than ever before. And of course, it was hugely influential in 1948 as never before, because the Supreme Court had ruled in Smith versus Allwright that for generations, African Americans were not allowed to vote in the South. They were disenfranchised. And the Supreme Court ruled in Smith versus Allwright, I believe it was 1944, might have been 1946, that African Americans are allowed to vote. That's what the Constitution says. And meanwhile, you have the Great Migration, where you have all of these black people from the South who had moved up to northern industrial centers for decades now, for work in the factories and to get out of the South where they were ill-treated. So Truman knew that black vote was going to be incredibly important in 1948 as never before, but he also considered this a deeply, deeply moral issue. And he came from Missouri, a state that was fully segregated, where the N-word was used in his house his whole life. And he goes on this campaign to say, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to take the Constitution and the 14th and 15th and 13th Amendments for what they say, and we're going to give these people their rights. Now, he knew saying this, it was going to shatter the Democratic Party, because a huge power base of the Democratic Party was the Solid South, right? These are all the people who had voted against Abraham Lincoln, the party of Lincoln, the Republicans from the Civil War. So from the Civil War all the way up to 1948, the Solid South had no Republican Party. It was just the Democrats. But these Democrats realize what Truman is doing, and they're like, screw this. And so at the 1948 Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, they staged this dramatic walkout, and they formed their own party, the Dixiecrats. And this is what you're looking at in this picture is their national convention, thrown together very quickly in Birmingham, Alabama. And I can actually read to you. I have it right here. That's Strom Thurmond. He becomes the candidate. He's a young governor of South Carolina. And this is what he says in his speech on that night from the pictures you're looking at, the picture there. I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. These uncalled for and these damnable proposals Truman has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights, I'll tell you, the American people had better wake up and oppose such a program, because the next thing will be a totalitarian state in these here United States. So that's what he's saying. And he goes out and he wins 4 states. On that campaign, he didn't say anything about Israel, didn't say anything about inflation or taxes. It was a one-issue candidacy, but the South felt so moved by him that he won 4 states.
And then was there another also? You mentioned 4.
There was. So can we see the picture of Henry Wallace, who, again, he won 0 states, but to me, his candidacy was fascinating. So here's Henry Wallace, and he was the vice president all through the war years and was very involved in the atomic bomb project. And he gets booted off the ticket in 1944 so Truman can become the VP. And he's ultimately made Secretary of Commerce, and he decides to run for president in 1948. And his reasoning, he believes that Harry Truman and our government are going to lead us into war with the Soviets, because, of course, in 1948, now we've got the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. This is happening. People are afraid this is going to be the end of the world, really. And so Henry Wallace says, I can save the human race. And he goes out and he campaigns on this idea that only I can stop this World War III from happening. And he goes on this campaign trip through the South. Well, let me start with this. He's so liberal. He's so far to the left. He goes to LA, Chicago, and New York. He packs Yankee Stadium. He packs stadiums with fans. But then courageously, he goes campaigning through North Carolina and these places where he knows that there's going to be trouble. And he ends up getting pelted with ice cream cones, tomatoes, and eggs. Literally, during speeches, there are riots, there are stabbings, literally, during his campaign appearances down south. But he decided that he needed to do this. And so I found I found, I guess, if you really sum up, the most fascinating thing, at least to me, about his candidacy in 1948 was the divide between the liberals in urban centers in LA and New York and the heartland of the country. And we see that exact same thing happening now.
Well, so your subtitle here, "The Battle for America's Soul," is this one of the key issues that you characterize there? What are there others, or is that the main one that we should kind of dive deeper into?
There are many, and let me read really quickly where that quote, that the subtitle comes from an epigraph. And this is Harry Truman speaking at Chicago Stadium on October 25, 1948. He says, "It is not just a battle between two parties. It is a fight for the very soul of the American government." And so that's why that's the Harry Truman quote. And it's the epigraph that opens the book. So when you read the book, it's the first thing you see. So you really understand where the subtitle comes from. But there were many issues. And I think what really has to be said is all four candidates, they campaigned as if the soul of the government was at stake. All four of them. They really believed it was.
And how did many people get the election forecast so wrong?
Great question. Okay. So in 1948 is the first election night broadcast on TV. First time it ever happened. I don't think I sent you guys a picture to show. Yeah, it's the first time on TV, and most Americans didn't have a television. So they listened to it on the radio, or they followed it, on the radio. But TV was playing a role. It was obvious, just as we're experiencing today in our generation now, of what it's like to experience presidential elections at the beginning of the social media age and now very entrenched in the social media age. They had TV for the first time. And when you look at the pictures and listen to the broadcast, you can look it up on YouTube. It's fascinating. And you realize how rudimentary all of this technology was and how unpolished, literally they're sitting there smoking cigarettes as they're talking into the camera of who's winning what state.
Well, let me stop you on that for just a second. So in elections today, there is a unwritten or whatever rule that elections are not called before they close in that state. What was the case in the 1948 election?
Well, I can tell you this: it went late into the night, and what I tried to capture when I'm writing about election night is like the excitement as the day moved on, because the day begins, it's a foregone conclusion. And in that 24-hour period, the history of the world changes. And the way people digested the news, there's a lot of that in the book because, there was a saying at the time, for a whole generation of people. For my generation, I remember when I was a kid, it was the space shuttle disaster. For another generation, it was when JFK was shot. At that time, there was the saying that I could remember exactly where I was on two occasions in my life. One was the attack at Pearl Harbor, and two was when I found out that Harry Truman won the 1948 election. That's how surprising it was to people.
Well, in modern day elections, there's the discussion about the challenge of polling, given many different factors, right? People are just more suspicious. They get a phone call, they've got a mobile phone, not a landline, so on and so forth. What was the state of the art in polling then, and were they? It sounds as if the polls were as wrong as everyone else in terms of what they were forecasting.
Absolutely they were. And the story of the polls in 1948, it's really kind of, there's a tremendous amount of mystery there because there were 5 major polls, and all of them had a pretty decent track record. They had shown that there was some element there was reason for people to believe the polls. And during the election, one of the 5 major pollsters said, "You know what? I'm not even going to poll this election. It's a waste of time and money because we know who's going to win." So he quit. He drops out. And the other four pollsters are constantly giving these numbers saying, Dewey's running away with it, Dewey's running away with it, Dewey's running away with it. And at one point, very late in the campaign, Harry Truman comes out and he gives this speech. I think it was in Cleveland, where he says, don't believe these pollsters. They're wrong. And all the pollsters work for newspapers, and the owners of those newspapers, it's in their best interest for me to lose this election. So don't believe them. It was basically what the whole fake news play that politicians make today. Truman made it then. Depending on who you are, and you have your own opinion of what's going on now. But Truman really believed it, and I think the motivations of the pollsters. I think he was probably wrong about that. But the fact is, they were incredibly wrong. They were so wrong. And one of the things I do at the end of the book is like the pollsters were on a hot seat. They had a lot of questions to answer, and none of them could really come up with any sort of definitive reason why they got it wrong. And I have my own theory, and that is, it's a theory because it's impossible to back up with data. But that is that so many people expected Truman to lose that a lot of Dewey voters thought it was a waste of time to go and vote. And you don't see a lot of huge discrepancy in terms of the turnout. The turnout was as high as it usually was in the ballpark. But I'm sure there were a lot of voters who didn't show up to vote because they thought that Dewey had it won, and they were too busy listening to the radio and smoking cigarettes and maybe having a beer.
Well, talk to us a little about election night or election day rather, and the kind of growing realization that this may not be turning out the way everyone was sure it was when the morning started.
Imagine the party at the presidential suite at the Muehlebach Hotel in Kansas City. That was the place to be. Sorry. That was the place to be. And Harry Truman, he had a trick up his sleeve that night. So we saw a picture of him casting his ballot earlier. And after that, he goes out to this big lunch that was hosted by a guy named Roger Sherman. And when you drive through Independence, Missouri today, you see Roger Sherman Library, Roger Sherman Laundromat. He's a well-known guy there. And he was the mayor. I think he was the mayor at the time. And Roger Sherman holds this lunch party for Truman. And they get together all their old friends from Independence, Missouri. And at the middle of it, Truman gets up and says he has to go to the bathroom. And he goes to the bathroom, and the Secret Service escort him out the back door. And he goes to this hotel and secludes himself without telling anybody where he is. He doesn't have a suitcase, so he borrows a bathrobe. He borrows some slippers. He orders a sandwich and a glass of buttermilk. It doesn't say anywhere in the literature, any of the research I found that, but I find it very hard to believe, knowing Truman, that he didn't have a bourbon with him. But he goes to sleep. And at some point, the phone rings, and it's the campaign headquarters, and they're saying, Mr. Truman, you've got to now win either, if I remember, it was Ohio, Illinois, or California. And he says, why? I'm going to win all three. Don't call me back again. I'm going back to sleep. And he hangs out and he goes to bed. And then Secret Service wakes him up at 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning after Senator McGrath of Rhode Island, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee, made the speech on television that Truman had won. And you can see that on YouTube. It is fun. So the Secret Service wakes up Truman and says, you won. And he says, let's go to Kansas City. So they jump in a car, they drive to Kansas City to the Muehlebach Hotel, takes the special elevator up that's just for him for the presidential suite, and people are just going nuts. And there's this incredibly moving scene. There's an oral history by a guy named Robert Nixon who was covering this he was a newspaper reporter, covered the whole campaign. And he describes in this oral history this moment where he knows that the president is there, and he's in this bedroom in the Muehlebach suite. And he peeks in there, the door's a little bit open, and he can see that Truman is crying. And he's talking to his wife and saying, we won. It's really moving moment for me. But then Harry gets on the train. It's actually the morning of November 4, where he gets from Kansas City over to St. Louis. They stop the train, and that's where they take the famous picture that we were talking about when we began with the Chicago Tribune newspaper. So that was, but you have to look in the book. I look at all four candidates, what they experienced, each of them, what their election night was like in 1948. And Henry Wallace's campaign was very moving because they won nothing. And they had so much passion and they believed so much in what they were trying to do. They thought they were going to save the country from war. They really did.
Well, this is so interesting. Again, I think folks, if our listeners are just deeply knowledgeable about history, but I think probably for most people, the other two campaigns would be real eye openers, as well as, of course, the details on the principal one. So, Carrie, do you want to rejoin us with questions from viewers? We were having some technical challenges earlier. Let's see if Carrie can come back and join us. If not, I've got a question or two here I'll raise. I'll tell you what, I will do that then. Let's just, Carrie, join us when you can. So one question, why did Truman not run in 1952?
Good question. That's one I don't get a lot. And I will tell you, I believe it's because he believed, and I believe that he, wow, I'm on camera, so I'm trying to remember.
That's right.
But he believed that after FDR, there should really only be two-term presidents. He didn't think that there should be, he had a couple of ideas about the way the federal government should work that were very important to him in terms of keeping the power in the hands, not of an individual, but in the hands of the people. And one was he wanted two terms. That's it for you as president. And the other was he spearheaded legislation to make sure that the succession of the presidency when he became president, the next in line, I think, was the Secretary of State. And what happened was he spearheaded election reform, just to make sure that if the president died and the vice president became president, that the next in line would be the Speaker of the House of Representatives, because he wanted it to be an elected official. So those two things, they kind of go together, but also give a window into how he viewed the role of the federal government.
Sure. Carrie, welcome. More questions? Carrie? I think we're continuing intermittent.
There, so
I think we still have some of those technical gremlins.
Well, as long as we're gremlining, let me say a couple of things.
Please.
One thing I will say is, I had a very interesting conversation with the people at the Truman Library yesterday. They did this incredible renovation of the museum there. And it's kind of sad because what they did is just extraordinary. And they opened the library, and it was very exciting. I was there for an early viewing with General Jim Mattis a few months ago. And they just did an amazing job. It's one of those once in a lifetime things you get to work on. And if you mess it up, you're really doomed. And they did an incredible job. And but then COVID has shut it down again. So it's sad. I encourage all those people who work so hard on that to keep the faith and know that things will right themselves in the future, and everybody go see it.
Well, that's a great tip. One of the things that Carrie and I have talked about, perhaps a couple of different ways, is doing more that put together some of these lists of great sites that people need to see. And the Truman Library is from the earlier generation of presidential libraries, right, as opposed to the giant museums and so forth that are being constructed now. So that's very interesting, a great recommendation. Carrie, should we give it one more try?
okay, can you hear me?
We
Let's try
can.
this. All right. All right. Was there anyone who believed that Truman could win?
Well, the obvious answer to this is yes.
Truman.
Very Truman.
And there was a joke aboard the campaign train that not even the first lady believed that he could win. That Truman was the only one that thought he could win. Even Mrs. Truman thought he was going to lose.
So why? Let me just follow that up very quickly. So you related the story about him being woken up and so forth, and you're going to have to win this or this, and he says, "I'm going to win them all." What was the basis for that?
Well, here's how I can answer that question. Truman, at the beginning of the election, he realized he's got to put together a campaign unprecedented in history. He's got to break all the rules, not all the rules, the right ones. And he comes up with this idea. And this is really at the heart of what the book is about. He comes up with this idea to get on a train and to go into all the small communities all over the country and talk to 8-9 speeches a day. And how he did this is really important. I don't know whether we have time to go into it, but he created this secret research division, and they would build up all of this research, and they would fly in an airplane, and the train would come through, and the airplane would hand off these briefcases, and it would be full of information. So every time Truman went into a little town, and he did this 8-9 times a day, he would speak from the back of his train in the rain in his pajamas. And he wanted to do two things: expose the American people to the magic of the American presidency. Because he knew if you go into a small community, the president of the United States, whether they like you, they hate you, they're going to show up because they just want to see what it looks like. And he thought, if I can make that happen, then I'm going to reveal not just the magic of the American presidency. I'm going to show him who Harry is, because he learned that he was a terrible public speaker. So when he tried to be FDR, he didn't succeed. But when he tried to be Harry Truman, people connected. So he tried to go all over, hundreds and hundreds of speeches. And these speeches are up on the Truman Library website. You can read them. They're fascinating because there was somebody taking shorthand. He would make up these speeches as he went, and there'd be someone taking shorthand. And so these speeches exist, and you can read them. They're fascinating. But that's really what it was about. It was about, he became really more than a candidate. He became sort of I forget the word I'm looking for, but really, just essentially an American icon.
Carrie, what do you think?
This has been fantastic. If you are losing me. We have a link to AJ's in the chat, and there's so much more to unpack there. It was a very interesting campaign. It's a great read, so check that out. And then if you have enjoyed this, if you enjoy these every week, you would have to consider a few things. Tell your friend about it, and help us keep this going and growing. And if you get those weekly emails, you can share those with your friends, share our posts on Facebook, Instagram, all those things. And we have a link in the chat where you can sign up for email. And you can consider making a small donation to the Pursuit of History. That's the nonprofit that keeps it running for you. Next week, we will be speaking with Kathleen Duval about a part of the Revolutionary War that often gets overlooked: the Spanish and American Indians in Florida and the Gulf Coast, and those who didn't really walk away winners from the American Revolution. So we hope you'll join us next week. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, AJ. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you.